There are reports that the U.S. may provide arms to Azerbaijan. Would that indicate that Section 907 has been dissolved?
No. Section 907 of the Freedom of Sport Act continues to be in place.
You do have to admit that there is growing tension between President Aliyev and President Putin. And could that escalate the way Putin's conflict with Zelensky did?
I understand President Putin sent birthday wishes to Mariban Aliyeva.
And could we see a scenario where Armenia and Azerbaijan outgrow their reliance on Russia?
No sign of that to this point.
Hello again and welcome. I'm Dr. Joanne Lasosky, journalism educator and author. We're here today to discuss issues of importance to the Caucasus. With us today is Ambassador Richard Kauzlarich. Ambassador Kauzlarich is the former ambassador to Azerbaijan and a distinguished visiting professor at the Sklar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. How do you assess the current U.S. policy toward the South Caucasus, especially after Washington and the Alaska summits?
What I'm a bit concerned about is that there hasn't been a whole lot of follow-up action from the August 8th summit in Washington. I think there was a sense that that was a successful meeting, that the witnessing of the initialing of the peace document, what I hope will be a peace document, was a positive sign. I think there was a sense that now Washington, with this trip concept, was going to be taking more of an active role in the South Caucasus. We should give the process a little time, but I'm a little concerned that things have not moved forward in terms of direct action between Washington and Baku and Yerevan. We've seen contacts between Iran and Armenia, between Armenia and Russia. And I just noticed there was a phone call between the Russian foreign minister and the Azerbaijani foreign minister. But as far as specific action coming from the U.S. side since that meeting, there hasn't really been anything that I've seen.
So, ostensibly, what do you see as the United States' main strategic interests in the South Caucasus today? Energy, security, democracy. What are the U.S. main interests there?
Let me take away a couple of things. I don't think it's democracy any longer. We've seen the release of the human rights report, the global report, but specifically the one on Azerbaijan. It's shorter than it was in previous years. Did not mention particularly the imprisonment of Dr. Gabadoglu. And it was, while not positive about Azerbaijan, it started with the sentence to the effect that there hasn't been any change in the human rights situation, which I don't think is true. It's gotten worse. On the energy side, I see no signs of increased activity from the United States in the energy sector in terms of its relations with Azerbaijan. It's pretty much as it's been. And the one area where a lot of attention was paid was this trip idea. And to this point, we've not heard much in terms of specific follow-up. We've heard the Iranians are not happy with the idea of a long-term American involvement along their border. I have not seen anything suggesting a Russian reaction, but I guess the most important set of interests now that the United States has would be to follow up on the August 8th summit and begin a process that would both lead ultimately to the peace agreement, but also operationalize whatever this presence the United States plans to have along that trip corridor.
And concerning the human rights report, do you think that that kind of report has any influence on Washington's policy toward the region?
The whole approach of the Trump administration to human rights is totally different than the Biden administration. If you look at some of the other reports, I mean, for other countries and other regions, there was strong language about human rights and freedom of expression in Europe, of all places. Uh, but it's not a a pillar, if you want to think of it in those terms, of U.S. foreign policy, which it had been across administrations up to the Trump period, of supporting democracy, supporting freedom of expression, and supporting human rights. So it's a selective policy, and it will be used as an instrument, as tariffs are used as an instrument in the case of particular countries like Venezuela and potentially other countries as well. But
So,
Azerbaijan and the South Caucasus, I don't think are on the top of the list.
so let's go back to August 8th. How credible do you find the ongoing peace talks between Baku and Yerevan? And what role should the United States play in these guarantees, these security guarantees for peace?
On one level, and I don't want to oversimplify this, but the fact that Trump organized the summit, successfully brought the two leaders together to make this commitment, both to peace and to trade and other connections between the two countries. The United States now owns the process, I would say. People are going to be turning to Washington. What are you going to do? What are you going to do, as you point out, to provide for security guarantees, which are obviously going to be a question. In a way, it's kind of the mirror image of what's going on in Ukraine now in the discussion of security guarantees. What sort of outside presence is necessary to make the peace process sustainable, and in the case of the South Caucasus, to make sure that 100-year lease, or however long it's developed for, remains a long-term transportation. I have not seen anything that would suggest, and again, I'm kind of limited by what appears in the media, but there hasn't been any public discussion of next steps, and particularly the role of the United States in providing security guarantees. It's one thing to watch, I think, is if the trip discussions go forward, that will be a very early indicator of how much the United States as a government is prepared to get involved.
So President Aliyev insists that constitutional reforms in Armenia are the legitimate condition for peace. Do you agree with that?
Well, he certainly made that case. I mean, that I don't think that's been a consistent element for a while now in the Azerbaijan position, and he regularly repeats that demand. Now, I don't know enough about Armenian domestic politics or constitutional processes, but I do know that even if they would decide to revise the constitution, it would take some time to formally put that in place. And there are, as I understand it, elections coming up in Armenia in 2026. And we all know that in the South Caucasus, whenever there's an election coming up, people say, well, we can't do anything about peace until we have our elections.
So do you think the election in Armenia could slow down this whole process?
Everyone knew that was not a new issue. What I think will slow down the process is the sense that either the parties are not following up on what they committed to in Washington, or that Washington, the Trump administration, is not pushing to see some progress on the understandings there. I think many of us were surprised. I certainly was, that the summit was put together in the way that it was, without a whole lot of public knowledge of what was going on, behind the scenes. I can only hope something similar is continuing now, and the very quiet atmosphere that seems to have followed Washington is being followed up, in quiet diplomacy and trying to advance both the peace agreement and then once that's in place, the longer term transportation link.
So speaking of this peace agreement, how likely is it that those external powers, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, will allow this U.S.-backed peace framework to succeed? Or
Yeah, I mean that's I tend to be a little pessimistic, particularly when it comes to Iran and Russia. Both have said over time that they publicly favor a peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But on the other hand, any effort to make that happen without direct involvement by either Tehran, Moscow, or both, is something that both countries would, I think, oppose. So, the fact that there hasn't been more of a visible reaction from Iran and Russia doesn't mean there won't be. Moscow has proven in the past that can disrupt contacts. Look at Georgia as a case study in that. But as I said, I tend to be pessimistic. The Turkey part is an interesting one to think about and speculate on, because if Turkey and Armenia are prepared to improve their bilateral relationship, and Azerbaijan does not oppose that, then there could be, kind of a good secondary consequence of the initialing of the peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan if Turkey and Armenia could move their relationship ahead. But that would be where I would watch for Turkish involvement. I don't think that that they have the problem that Iran and Russia have with the basic process that Washington now has brought about with the summit. But it's a different game than the direct Armenia-Azerbaijan connection.
So there are reports that the U.S. may provide arms to Azerbaijan. Would that indicate that Section 907 has been dissolved?
No. It would indicate that, and what I've seen in terms of the written executive order in the press, it was waived. 907 was waived, which has been the policy since the 9/11 attacks on the United States. And what that means is Section 907 of the Freedom of Sport Act continues to be in place, but the administration, for national security reasons, is prepared to provide military sales, perhaps assistance and training to Azerbaijan. That was something the Biden administration had blocked, I think largely because of the lack of progress on the peace front, but also on human rights grounds. Now, what the Trump administration will do that's different than previous administrations, previous administrations who had waived 907 were very careful about the kind of training and the kind of equipment that the United States was prepared to make available to Azerbaijan. Again, it's another example of something we have to wait and see. But 907 is still out there. When Congress comes back, expect a lot of noise and hand wringing on the part of supporters of Armenia about what the administration has done. And continued efforts by members of Congress to put pressure on Azerbaijan on human rights grounds, and the whole issue of the future of the Armenian officials who are being held in Azerbaijan, what their future is. So I think that is where there's going to be some excitement, but the 907 point, again, it's more back to where things were before the Biden administration did not renew the waiver. And we'll just have to see what, in terms of real consequences, what those are for military cooperation between the U.S. and Azerbaijan.
So do you think Russia will still act as a spoiler for any Western mediated deal? And could we see a scenario where Armenia and Azerbaijan outgrow their reliance on Russia?
No sign of that to this point. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, both countries have had high-level contacts with Moscow since the meeting in Washington. I just can't imagine that Russia has acquiesced to kind of the U.S. playing the dominant role in the South Caucasus or replacing Russia's role that still is there. They have the military bases, customs officials in Armenia. And while the same thing does not apply in the case of Azerbaijan, they still have very close economic relationships, including in the energy sector with Baku. So I think Russia is still to be heard from. Let me put it that way. But I can't imagine that they're simply going to walk away because of this one meeting.
But you do have to admit that there is growing tension between President Aliyev and President Putin. And could that escalate the way Putin's conflict with Zelensky did? Could Azerbaijan become Russia's next problem neighbor?
Azerbaijan has two practical problems with Moscow today. One is the round of arrests and police action against Azerbaijanis in Russia. And second is the unwillingness of Moscow to admit responsibility to the downing of the Azal passenger flight. So those two areas are, I guess, kind of signposts to watch for any change in the relationship between Moscow and Baku. I understand President Putin sent birthday wishes to Mariban Aliyeva, and he's used, if you will, soft power relationships to his advantage in this region, and he may trying to send a positive signal. I don't see things, absent some major wild card development in the relationship. I don't see things getting worse, but I also don't see things getting better until there's some satisfaction that President Aliyev would express regarding the Azal shoot down. So, I think it's kind of at this not very friendly, but not necessarily going to break diplomatic relations stage between Azerbaijan and Russia.